October 15, 1943, Schweinfurt, Germany. The P-38. Lightning looked wrong to everyone who saw it for the first time. 2 engines, 2 tails, and a pilot sitting in what looked like a glass egg between them. German pilots called it the fork-tailed devil when they were being polite. When they weren't, they laughed at the American attempt to build a fighter that looked more like a failed science experiment. Major Thomas McGuire from New Jersey watched the Messerschmitts forming up at 25,000 feet and knew they'd stop laughing in about 30 seconds. The 450 caliber machine guns and single 20mm cannon in his Lightning's nose were all zeroed to converge at exactly 300 yards. At that distance, anything caught in the crosshairs simply ceased to exist. The mission had started before dawn at the 8th Air Force Base in England. 200 B-17 Flying Fortresses needed escort deep into Germany to hit the ball-bearing factories that kept the Wehrmacht's tanks rolling. The bombers could defend themselves with their 13 machine guns each, but the German fighters had learned to attack from angles where only 1 or 2 guns could bear. That's where the P-38s came in. 48 Lightnings, each carrying enough fuel in their drop tanks to make the 1,500-mile round trip. McGuire had been flying fighters for 3 years, but the Lightning still surprised him. At high altitude, where other fighters gasped for air, the twin turbocharged Allison engines pulled strong. The counter-rotating propellers eliminated torque, making it fly straight as a rifle shot. And those guns in the nose meant no convergence problems like wing-mounted weapons. Everything fired straight ahead in a stream of lead and explosive shells that could saw a bomber in half. The radio crackled with German voices. McGuire didn't speak the language, but he recognized the tone. Confidence, maybe even amusement. The Luftwaffe pilots were looking at the strange twin-boomed American fighters and seeing easy kills. They'd fought P-38s before over North Africa and Sicily, usually flown by green pilots who didn't understand the plane's strengths. But McGuire and his squadron had spent 6 months learning every trick the Lightning could perform. They knew to never turn fight with a Messerschmitt. They knew to use their superior dive speed and zoom climb. Most importantly, they knew about the sweet spot at 300 yards where mathematics and ballistics turned their nose-mounted weapons into a death ray. The first Messerschmitt 109 dove from above, typical German tactics using altitude advantage. The pilot probably expected McGuire to brake left or right, the standard defensive move. Instead, McGuire pulled the Lightning straight up, using the twin engine's power to climb at an angle that would stall most fighters. The German pilot, committed to his dive, flashed past underneath. McGuire rolled inverted and dropped the nose, now above and behind the Messerschmitt, 350 yards, 325, 300. The reflector gun sight filled with gray-painted aluminum. McGuire pressed the gun button. The Lightning shuddered as all 5 weapons fired. The concentrated fire looked like a bright rope connecting the 2 planes. The Messerschmitt's tail section separated first, then the wings folded backward, and the engine exploded in a ball of orange fire and black smoke. 2 seconds of firing, maybe 60 rounds total. The German pilot never had time to bail out. The smell of cordite filled McGuire's cockpit despite the oxygen mask. His hands were steady on the control yoke, but his heart hammered against his ribs. First kill of the day, but he could see at least 30 more German fighters converging on the bomber stream. The temperature at 25,000 feet was 40 below zero, but sweat ran down his back under the fleece-lined flight suit. He'd wanted to be a pilot since watching Barnstormers in Nebraska as a kid. His father, a mechanic for the Union Pacific Railroad, had saved for 2 years to pay for flying lessons. Now, 10 years later, he was using those lessons to kill men he'd never met over a country he'd never wanted to visit. Lieutenant Jim Morrison from Texas pulled alongside, his Lightning's polished aluminum skin reflecting the morning sun. Morrison had been a crop duster before the war, used to flying low and dangerous. He'd adapted to combat like he was born for it, already had 4 kills to his credit. Through hand signals, Morrison indicated 2 Focke-Wulf 190s climbing from 9 o'clock low. The 190 was Germany's best fighter, faster than the Messerschmitt and more heavily armed. But it had one weakness. Its radial engine couldn't maintain power above 20,000 feet, as well as the Lightning's turbocharged Allisons. McGuire and Morrison rolled into a diving turn, using the P-38's weight to build speed. 400 miles per hour, 450. The airframe creaked and groaned. At 475, the controls started to feel strange, mushy. They were approaching compressibility, where the airflow over the wings approached the speed of sound and the plane stopped responding normally. McGuire eased back on the yoke, bleeding speed. The 2 Focke-Wulfs saw them coming and split, one breaking left, one right. Classic defensive move, forcing the attackers to choose. Morrison went left. McGuire stayed on the right target. The German pilot was good, rolling and skidding, making himself a difficult target. But he was also losing energy with each maneuver, while McGuire kept his speed up with gentle turns. The distance closed. 400 yards, 350. The German rolled inverted and dove, trying to escape. McGuire followed, the Lightning's nose dropping toward the earth far below. The altimeter unwound. 20,000 feet, 15,000, 10,000. The Focke-Wulf started to pull out, its pilot probably worried about compressing. McGuire stayed with him, the G-forces crushing him into his seat. Gray fog crept in from the edges of his vision. He grunted, tightening his stomach muscles to keep blood in his brain. The gun sight pip settled on the Focke-Wulf. 300 yards exactly. McGuire fired a 2-second burst. The 20mm cannon shells exploded along the German's fuselage from engine to tail. The plane rolled slowly to the right, trailing white glycol coolant that looked like blood in the morning light. The canopy came off and McGuire saw the pilot struggle out, his parachute blooming white, against the green German countryside 8,000 feet below. Morrison's voice crackled over the radio. He'd gotten his target too, but picked up damage in the process. Hydraulic fluid streaming from his right engine nacelle. That meant his landing gear might not work when they got back to England. If they got back to England. McGuire checked his fuel gauges. The drop tanks were empty, internal tanks showing 3/4, enough to make it home if they didn't have to fight much more. But the bomber stream was still 200 miles from the target, and German fighters kept coming like angry hornets. A B-17 named Lucky Lady took a direct hit from a German rocket and broke in half. McGuire watched men tumble from the wreckage, some on fire, some trying to open parachutes that tangled in the plane's debris. The waist gunner from the bomber next to it kept firing at German fighters even as his own plane's No. 3 engine burned. These bomber crews had brass ones, McGuire thought, sitting ducks in their flying fortresses, maintaining formation, while fighters tore at them from every angle. The P-38s tried to protect them, but there weren't enough escorts, never were. Captain Bill Anderson from Minnesota brought his damaged Lightning alongside. Half his rudder was gone, shot away by a 109's cannon. The plane flew crooked, Anderson fighting to keep it straight. He'd already shot down 2 Germans, but paid for it. Through hand signals, he indicated he was heading home. McGuire watched him peel away, descending toward England, hoping the damaged control surfaces would hold together for 500 more miles. They'd been roommates in training, had planned to open a flying service together after the war. Now Anderson might not make it to lunch. The temperature in the cockpit had dropped even more. McGuire's breath formed ice crystals on the inside of his canopy, despite the defroster running full blast. His fingers were numb inside the leather gloves, making it hard to feel the trigger on the control wheel. The oxygen mask chafed against his face, where yesterday's mission had already rubbed it raw. 23 years old, and he felt ancient, like this war had aged him a decade and 6 months. His mother wrote every week from New Jersey. All was ending with, "Pray for your safety." He hadn't told her he'd stopped praying after watching his third wingman burn to death, trapped in his cockpit over France. More German fighters appeared from the east. Messerschmitt 110s this time, twin-engine heavy fighters like the Lightning, but slower, less agile. They carried rockets under their wings, meant for the bombers. McGuire led 3 other P-38s in a slashing attack from above. The German formation scattered, jettisoning their rockets to gain maneuverability, but the 110s were no match for Lightnings in a dogfight. McGuire lined up on one trying to escape by diving toward the cloud deck at 8,000 feet. The German crew, pilot and rear gunner, must have known they were finished. The rear gunner kept firing his machine guns even as McGuire closed to 300 yards. The tracers flashed past McGuire's canopy, one round starring the bulletproof glass right in front of his face. He pressed the trigger. The concentrated fire from the Lightning's nose guns took the 110's left wing off at the root. The plane snap-rolled and went straight down, no chance for the crew to escape. McGuire felt nothing watching it fall, no satisfaction, no remorse, just empty. 6 months ago, his first kill had made him vomit in his oxygen mask. Now it was arithmetic: speed, angle, distance, trigger. The men in those planes had families, dreams, favorite songs. But up here, they were just aluminum targets that shot back. Think too much about it, and you'd go crazy. Several pilots in the squadron already had. Combat fatigue, the doctors called it. The 1,000-yard stare at the officers' club, hands shaking so bad they couldn't hold a coffee cup, jumping when someone slammed a door. McGuire wondered when his turn would come. The bombers had finally reached Schweinfurt and began their bomb run. This was the most dangerous time, when they had to fly straight and level for the bombardiers to aim. German flak filled the sky with black puffs of smoke, each one representing hundreds of pieces of shrapnel looking for aluminum skin to tear. A B-17 took a direct hit and simply disappeared, transformed into a cloud of debris in less than a second. 10 men gone just like that. Another Fortress lost an entire wing and went into a flat spin, centrifugal force pinning the crew inside as it fell 30,000 feet to impact. Morrison's damaged Lightning suddenly rolled inverted without warning. The hydraulic failure had affected his control surfaces. McGuire watched helplessly as his wingman's plane entered an inverted spin. Morrison's voice came over the radio, calm, as if discussing weather. "Can't recover. Tell Martha I loved her." The Lightning spun faster, tighter, until it was just a silver blur falling toward Germany. McGuire kept watching, hoping to see a parachute. Nothing. Morrison rode it all the way down, probably unconscious from the G-forces, maybe already dead. Another friend gone. Another letter McGuire would have to write. The surviving bombers turned for home after dropping their loads on the ball-bearing factories. Smoke columns rose 10,000 feet from the burning targets, but the mission had cost them. McGuire counted the formations. They'd started with 200 bombers, maybe 150 remained, and many of those were damaged, struggling to maintain formation, leaving trails of oil or glycol. The German fighters followed them, pecking at the stragglers like wolves culling the weak from a herd. The P-38s were running low on ammunition and fuel, but they kept engaging, trying to protect the wounded birds. McGuire found himself alone, separated from his flight during the chaos over the target. His fuel gauges showed less than half. Ammunition counters indicated maybe 20 seconds of firing time left. He climbed to 30,000 feet, above most of the fight, and turned west toward England. The twin Allisons purred smoothly, but he knew that could change instantly. One bullet in the wrong place, one mechanical failure, and he'd be walking home through occupied France, if he survived the bailout. P-38 pilots had trouble escaping the aircraft in emergencies. Those twin booms and the center nacelle created a forest of aluminum to navigate while falling. A glint of sunlight below caught his eye. A lone Messerschmitt 109, stalking a damaged B-17 that had fallen behind the formation. The bomber's tail guns were silent, probably out of ammunition, or the gunner was dead. The German was taking his time, staying in the bomber's blind spot below and behind, pumping cannon shells into the engines. McGuire rolled the Lightning inverted and pulled through a split S, dropping like a hawk on the unsuspecting fighter. The dive built speed quickly, 300 miles per hour, 400, 450. The German pilot never saw him coming, focused on his helpless prey. 300 yards. McGuire fired his last long burst. The nose guns hammered out their deadly convergence. The 109 broke apart like it had been hit with a giant cleaver. The engine separated from the fuselage, the wings folded, the tail snapped off. The pilot's body, freed from the disintegrating cockpit, tumbled through the air. His parachute opened, but his flight suit was on fire. McGuire watched him fall, trying to beat out flames that wouldn't go out at 300 miles per hour. The man's screams came through the radio somehow, terrible and short. The parachute caught fire and collapsed. The German fell the last 5,000 feet in seconds. The saved B-17 waggled its wings in thanks and rejoined the formation. McGuire checked his fuel one more time, maybe enough to reach England if he throttled back and descended to a more fuel-efficient altitude. He reduced power and started a gentle descent, the Lightning responding smoothly despite the combat damage he hadn't noticed until now. Holes in the left boom, the right engine running rough, oil pressure fluctuating. The coast of Holland passed below, then the North Sea, gray and cold and unforgiving. Dozens of planes had gone down in that water. The crews that survived the crash lasted maybe 10 minutes in the freezing waves. The English coast appeared through the haze, those white cliffs that meant safety. McGuire's fuel gauges bounced on empty. The right engine coughed, coughed again. He shut it down to save the last drops of gas for the left engine. The Lightning could fly on one engine, but not for long and not well. He called the tower at his base, declaring emergency. They cleared him for straight-in approach. The left engine quit 2 miles from the runway. McGuire pushed the nose down, trading altitude for speed, stretching the glide. The runway numbers grew larger in his windscreen, 1 mile, half a mile. The Lightning settled toward the ground, silent except for the wind over the wings. The main wheels touched down just past the threshold. McGuire had never heard a more beautiful sound than rubber meeting concrete. The Lightning rolled to a stop halfway down the runway, completely out of fuel, ammunition expended, riddled with holes. Ground crews ran out with a tow vehicle. McGuire sat in the cockpit for a moment, hands shaking, now that the adrenaline was fading. 6 Germans shot down today. Morrison dead. Anderson probably dead. How many more missions before his luck ran out? The crew chief, a sergeant from Brooklyn, climbed up on the wing. Rough one, Major? McGuire could only nod. They were all rough ones. That night in the officers' club, McGuire drank bourbon and tried not to think about the German pilot falling with his parachute on fire. The intelligence officer had confirmed the mission results. They destroyed the ball-bearing factories but lost 60 bombers and 8 fighters, nearly 700 men, dead or captured, for ball bearings. The Germans would have the factories running again in 3 months. Then they'd go back and do it all over again. McGuire wondered how many times a man could watch friends die before he broke. He was about to find out. The next morning brought another mission briefing, Berlin this time. The Big B maximum effort, every available plane. The weather officer predicted clear skies over the target, perfect for bombing, perfect for fighters. The German defenses around Berlin were the heaviest in Europe. McGuire looked at the faces around him in the briefing room. Half would be gone in 6 months, replaced by kids fresh from training who'd last maybe 10 missions before they too were gone. The math was simple and brutal. 25 missions to complete a tour. Average losses of 5% per mission. Nobody wanted to calculate those odds. McGuire's crew chief had worked through the night patching the Lightning. Not pretty, but functional. The guns were loaded, the tanks topped off, engines run up and checked. The plane that had seemed so strange when McGuire first saw it had become an extension of himself. He knew every rivet, every sound, every vibration that meant trouble. The Lightning had saved his life a dozen times, and he'd pushed it to its limits in return. Together, they'd survived 37 missions, 13 more to go home, assuming the math didn't catch up. The mission to Berlin went as expected. Bad. They lost 80 bombers and 12 fighters. McGuire shot down 3 more Germans, watching each one fall with the same emptiness. One pilot bailed out successfully, and McGuire found himself relieved. Not for the Germans' sake, but for his own. He needed to know he could still feel something. The Lightning performed flawlessly despite taking more damage. Cannon shells through the left boom, machine gun bullets stitching across the wing. The plane flew home wounded but steady, like a tired horse that knew the way to the barn. 2 weeks later, McGuire's roommate came back. Anderson had made it to an emergency field in southern England, had spent 10 days in the hospital with a concussion from the crash landing. His flying days were over, though. The doctors found he'd lost most of his hearing from a head wound he didn't remember getting. Anderson seemed relieved. "I'm going home, Mac, going to see my kids grow up. Open that flying service on my own." They both knew McGuire might not make it back to join him. They didn't talk about it. Just shared a bottle of scotch and told stories about training, about the girls they'd dated, about anything except the war. November turned to December. The weather got worse, giving them a break from long missions. But the Germans had moved more fighters west, and even milk runs to France turned deadly. McGuire watched the replacement pilots arrive, bright-eyed and eager. He tried to teach them what he'd learned. Trust your plane, use your advantages, never turn with a 109, always check 6. 300 yards was the magic distance. Most important, don't think about it too much. Just fly, shoot, survive. Half of them were dead in 2 weeks anyway. The Lightning continued to prove itself. In the right hands, it was deadly. The concentrated firepower, the speed, the range, the altitude performance. German pilots had learned to respect it, no longer laughing at the twin-boomed devil. Some refused to engage P-38s unless they had numerical advantage. The nose-mounted guns had become legendary. No convergence issues, no dispersion. At 300 yards, it was like pointing a laser beam of destruction. McGuire had become an ace 3 times over with 18 confirmed kills. The number meant nothing to him. They were just aluminum crosses in his logbook. Christmas came and went with no celebration. They flew on Christmas Eve, escorting bombers to Munich. Lost 2 wingmen to flak. Spent Christmas Day writing letters to their families. McGuire couldn't remember what he wrote. Lies, probably. "Doing fine. Food's good. Don't worry." The truth would have destroyed his mother, that he woke up screaming sometimes, that he'd started drinking bourbon for breakfast, that he could still see every face of every man he'd killed, German and American both, falling through cold European skies. January 1944 brought the worst weather anyone could remember: fog, snow, ice. The kind that made flying suicide even without Germans shooting at you. But they flew anyway. The bombers had to get through. The invasion of France was coming, everyone knew it, and they had to destroy the Luftwaffe before it happened. So they flew into weather that would have grounded peacetime airlines, found the bombers by instinct and luck, fought battles in clouds where you couldn't see 50 feet, and somehow made it home. Usually, McGuire's hands had developed a permanent shake. The flight surgeon wanted to ground him, but there weren't enough experienced pilots left. They gave him Benzedrine for energy, phenobarbital to sleep, bourbon for everything else. He was 23 years old and felt 50. His crew chief, the kid from Brooklyn, had to help him into the cockpit some mornings when his hands shook too badly to climb. But once the engine started, once he was in the air, the shaking stopped. The Lightning steadied him, or maybe he steadied it. They'd become one organism, metal and flesh, united in purpose. Mission 45 should have been Milk Run. Escort bombers to Pas-de-Calais just across the channel. Light defenses, home for lunch. but the Germans had moved a new squadron of Focke-Wulf 190s to the area. McGuire saw them climbing from the south, at least 30 fighters. His flight had 6 Lightnings. The bombers were 5 minutes from target. McGuire made the call. They'd engage, buy the bombers time. 6 against 30. The math was impossible, but they'd faced impossible before. The fight was brutal and quick. McGuire shot down 2 in the first pass, that deadly convergence at 300 yards, turning the German fighters into aluminum confetti. But there were too many. His wingman took cannon shells through the cockpit and went down burning. Another Lightning exploded when a German rocket found the fuel tanks. McGuire's plane took hits everywhere. The left engine caught fire. The right engine started running rough. Hydraulics failed. The controls got heavy, unresponsive. But he kept fighting, kept firing, until the guns ran dry. A Focke-Wulf sat on his tail, pumping shells into the Lightning's booms. McGuire could feel the plane dying, systems failing one by one. The instrument panel sparked and smoked. The canopy starred from bullet impacts. The stick shook in his hands as control surfaces were shot away. He rolled, inverted, and dove, the last defensive move he had. The German followed, 300 yards behind. If McGuire had ammunition, it would be perfect, but he was out of everything except altitude, and that was running out fast. The Focke-Wulf's cannon shells walked up the Lightning's fuselage toward the cockpit. McGuire could see the German pilot in his mirrors, close enough to make out his face, young, focused, doing his job, just like McGuire had done 18 times. The shells reached the cockpit. The armored glass held for a second, then exploded inward. McGuire felt the impacts, sharp and hot, then cold, spreading from his chest. The Lightning's nose dropped toward France. Controls dead, pilot dying. McGuire pulled the emergency release with his last strength. The canopy flew away, and cold air blasted him. He rolled the plane left and fell out, clearing the tail booms by inches. His parachute opened automatically, the jolt sending spears of pain through his chest. He looked down and saw red spreading across his flight suit. 3 holes, maybe 4. Blood ran down his legs, dripped off his boots into space. The Focke-Wulf circled him once. The German pilot waved, then headed east. Professional courtesy. McGuire was finished, no longer a threat. The ground came up slowly, then fast. French countryside, probably occupied. McGuire hit hard, his legs buckling. The parachute dragged him 50 feet before he could release it. He lay in a muddy field, looking at gray sky, feeling life leak out through holes in his chest. His hands had stopped shaking for the first time in months. He thought about his father, wondered if the old man would be proud. Thought about Morrison and his wife Martha, about Anderson and his flying service, about ball bearings and strategic targets, and all the reasons they said this dying was worth it. French farmers found him an hour later. Resistance, thank God, not collaborators. They carried him to a barn, did what they could with bandages and sulfa powder. A doctor came that night, an old man who spoke English. "You will live, I think, but no more flying. The lung is collapsed, the liver touched. You are finished with war." McGuire wanted to cry from relief, but couldn't. Everything was numb, distant. He spent 3 weeks in that barn, fevered and delirious, dreaming of lightnings and convergence zones and falling Germans. The resistance moved him at night to the coast, then onto a fishing boat, then a British MTB that ran him to Dover. He woke up in an American hospital, clean sheets, real doctors, morphine for the pain. A colonel came to see him, brought a Distinguished Service Cross and news. The invasion had succeeded. The Luftwaffe was broken. The war would end soon. McGuire nodded like it mattered. They shipped him home on a hospital ship, 200 wounded men stacked in bunks, all broken in different ways. His mother met him at the dock in New York. She'd aged 10 years in 2, hair gone gray, face lined with worry. She cried when she saw him on crutches, 40 pounds lighter, eyes empty. His father stood behind her, the tough railroad mechanic trying not to show emotion. They drove home in silence. McGuire stared out the window at America, at people living normal lives, walking around like the world wasn't on fire 5,000 miles away. He wanted to scream at them, tell them about Morrison and Anderson and 60 bombers falling in one day. But he just sat quietly, hands shaking again. The doctors at the VA hospital said he'd recover, mostly. The lung would always be weak, the liver scarred. The shaking might stop eventually. The dreams, well, everyone had those. They gave him a medical discharge, 40% disability, thanked him for his service. McGuire went home to his childhood room, stared at model airplanes hanging from the ceiling, wondered how he'd ever thought flying was romantic. The boy who'd built those models was dead, killed somewhere over Germany. A stranger had come home in his uniform, Anderson wrote from Minnesota. The flying service was up and running, crop dusting mostly, some charter work. The offer to join him stood whenever McGuire was ready. McGuire wrote back that he might never be ready. He couldn't imagine sitting in a cockpit again, feeling engines start, watching instruments. Every time he heard a plane overhead, he looked for fighters on its tail. Every time he smelled oil or gasoline, he was back at 25,000 feet watching friends burn. The lightning had saved him and destroyed him in equal measure. Years passed. The shaking stopped mostly. The dreams faded to once a week instead of nightly. McGuire took a job at an aircraft factory, designing parts for civilian planes. He could work with aircraft as long as he didn't have to fly them. He married a nurse who understood why he woke up screaming sometimes, had 2 kids who would never really know what their father had done in the war. He didn't tell them. How could he explain the convergence zone at 300 yards? How could he describe Morrison's last words or the German pilot falling with his parachute on fire? In 1960, McGuire attended a reunion of Lightning pilots in Dayton. Gray-haired men with paunches, telling war stories that got funnier and less terrible with time. Someone had brought a restored P-38, polished and perfect. They invited McGuire to sit in it. He climbed up slowly, settled into the seat. Everything was exactly where he remembered. The gun sight, the throttles, the trigger on the control wheel. For a moment he was 23 again, checking 6, computing deflection, waiting for 300 yards. His hands started shaking. He climbed out quickly, made excuses, drove home, and never went to another reunion. The Germans had been right to laugh at first. The P-38 did look ridiculous, like something a child would draw, but they'd learned what McGuire and others had learned. That strange configuration meant something. The nose guns didn't converge at 300 yards. They were already converged, focused, deadly. No wing-mounted weapons spreading their fire in a cone of hope. Just concentrated destruction, flying straight and true. The Lightning was a killer, pure and simple, and it had turned farm boys and teachers and mechanics into killers too. Efficient, effective, empty. McGuire died in 1987, the lung finally giving out from the damage taken over France. His son found a box in the attic afterward. 18 small German flags, 1 for each kill. A logbook with neat entries recording death in bureaucratic detail. A faded photo of Morrison and Anderson and McGuire standing in front of a Lightning, young and immortal and doomed. A letter from Morrison's widow thanking McGuire for trying to save her husband, for writing to tell her Jim's last words. At the bottom of the box, wrapped in oilcloth, was a piece of aluminum from McGuire's Lightning. Twisted, punctured, painted olive drab. On it, barely visible, was stenciled 300 YDS, the convergence zone marking from the gun sight. The son donated everything to a museum. The curator was excited, called it a significant find, evidence of the air war's brutal efficiency. He asked if the son had any stories about his father's service. The son said no. McGuire had never talked about it, except once. After a few drinks at his grandson's wedding, someone had asked about the war. McGuire had gone quiet for a long moment, then said, "The Lightning's guns converged at 300 yards. At that range, you couldn't miss. Couldn't miss." He'd started crying then, quiet tears from an old man remembering young men falling through German skies, and they'd changed the subject. The P-38 Lightning was retired from service in 1949, replaced by jets that flew faster and higher and killed more efficiently. But for those who flew it in combat, who felt its twin engines pull them home on one good motor and prayer, who watched its nose guns turn enemy fighters into memory and regret, it remained the defining machine of their lives. Beautiful and ugly, powerful and vulnerable, savior and destroyer. The Germans had stopped laughing at it eventually, but for the Americans who flew it, who came home broken and haunted by what they'd done at 300 yards, there was never anything funny about the fork-tailed devil. It was simply the tool that had turned them into something they'd spend the rest of their lives trying to forget. Thanks for joining us on this journey through one of history's incredible survival stories. If you found it compelling, give it a like and share it with someone who appreciates these tales of courage. And don't forget to subscribe for more.